Thank you very much for having me today. First and foremost, I want to mention in the decade or so that I've been here at Weber, I've been really impressed with a couple initiatives that are coming from the administration that are kind of coalescing simultaneously. And one happens to be this idea of making sure that as many of you undergraduates have terrific opportunities to do professional work, presentations, travel, research, whatever that entails. And there is a huge push going on in that, along with CEL, which is community engaged learning or service learning. Those seem to be the two largest initiatives that have been happening in the past 5 years. So trust me when I tell you that the money is out there for you, the support is out there for you, and everyone, both your teachers and the administration at Weber, are really concerned that if this is something you want to do, that we can help it work for you. We can help make it work for you. I'm grateful for an opportunity to put this together, but I have to caution you, it's been kind of, I feel like it's a little slapdash. And this is definitely, today is the test run for this information, although it's kind of typical things that we might offer our students, particularly in our capstone projects, which are the MFA degrees when they have their exhibit just before they graduate. So I'm going to roll in several of the things that I might typically talk about to my students in class today in terms of how I'm talking to you about how to put together a succinct, solid kind of proposal that's going to equate with the sciences and put you on even footing so that it's recognized when the reviewers take a look at it. So of course there is our question. I have changed my title or adjusted a little to call it Lost in Translation, but also Found in Translation today. I'm going to start with a couple basic ideas that I'd like you to see if you can kind of absorb and take in before we get into something a little bit more specific in terms of a methodology. First of all, you need to keep in mind that the fine arts, and here I've listed several, but not by any means all of the types of disciplines that might be included in the non-scientific research, the visual arts, music, movement, dance, theater, and poetry. We have a different type of problem solving, or a different process that we go through to problem solve. And because of that, each one of these disciplines you should begin to think of as sort of its own foreign language. And therefore, once you're trained in this language, just as if you were learning how to speak Farsi, for example, in 4 years, you are going to have to help translate that to the reviewers of your proposal. Because it is a language that, because we've got eyes, we all know that we're visual in some form or manner, or any of those others, but it isn't necessarily something that they'll be well versed in. So your job is to be pretty accurate, thoughtful, and smart about making that translation. I'm going to give you a few structural differences as at least I've come to understand the scientific approach versus the artistic approach. In the scientific, and these, like I say, are generalizations, so none of this is black and white, cut or dry. There's lots of room for interpretation, fudging, chances to go out in different directions, but just as a generalization, the scientific tends to be more quantitative, about numbers, about things, exactness, whereas the artistic is more qualitative. What gives value and quality to our life? Science might be about what is life, but the arts are how can we make it worth living. The scientific tends to be more empirical. It works through a system of experimentation to come to an observable outcome that then can be stated and defined. Whereas the artistic is much more open-ended. It's a creative process where the end result is not necessarily anything you can anticipate when you start out. You guess at what it's going to be, but the process has a lot of different paths and directions that you just have to trust as you're in the process. The scientific denotes, it states, it's factual, whereas artistic tends to connote, it tends to imply, it tends to imbue. It's more about innovative and imagination versus factual. And I like to think of the scientific as finding evidence to support the hypothesis, whereas in art you're trying to give visibility to something that is more invisible. It might be a feeling, it might be an idea, it might be any combination of those, it might be a metacognitive process. But we're trying to give a visual form to those to help expand the conversation about that basic idea. Of course, I'm an artist, so I had to put it in picture form too. Scientific, I like to think of it as taking lots of information and bringing it down to a very specific end result. And the artistic usually start with one idea and it forms a sort of umbrella of ideas and how they're all connected. So the scientific from one expansive to something much smaller and unique, where the artistic tends to go from a single idea and broaden and give us a nice arching base to how we're thinking about things. All right, so those are just some big general ideas in terms of how you should shift your thinking when you approach it if you're in the arts or if you're an artist writing for a grant. General overviews. You still have to describe your project. You want to discuss its relevancy, and of course, all art is relevant. It could be something as simple as you want to talk about texture and how important it is in our life, or it could be very esoteric, and you might talk about our understanding of visual literacy, for example, and the fact we look at 4,000 images a day. So there's a full gamut there in terms of what its relevancy will be and how you want to connect it. But you can trust yourself that it's there. Don't dismiss that before you get started. Establish a timetable, and you'll hear this often. Usually it's best to start at the end and work backwards. You want to confirm your budget, and especially artists, because we tend to be, you know, a little bit more out there. People understand this as more loosey-goosey, that type of thing. You really want to be super tight. Dot the I's, cross the T's, get your information. If you're traveling, make sure you're down to the penny how much it's going to cost you to go someplace. Because that will help them understand that you have the organizational skills behind the artistic outlook to put something together that's really valid. Determine the dissemination of your final outcome. You know, how is this going to contribute to the bigger picture, to the conversation, to your local community, to the global community? Typically, scientists will publish a paper. They might give a talk on their stuff. Musicians tend to give concerts, and artists tend to have exhibitions. Those are just general ways to think about it. But when you see that question about dissemination, how are you going to spread what you've discovered? Usually it will be a visual outcome, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Maybe you want to do some outreach in the community. Maybe you want to start a class that replicates some ideas that you were doing. There's lots of possibilities, so don't feel that you're necessarily locked into it, but certainly don't feel that they expect you to end up with a project that looks like a scientist's project. All right, so here's how to get started if you're talking about writing what I call an artist statement, what we in our field call an artist statement. Typically, in the broader terms, it's called the abstract, and you'll often find that on one of the scholarship application forms, of which I've included in the handout there. The link list states it as that. I've come to let my students know that this is probably one of the most comprehensive and yet essential, without being simplistic, ways of looking at a work of art, be it visual, musical, dance, or otherwise. And that is all good art, all legitimate art, has a subject, it has a form, and it has a concept. And we call those the what, the how, and the why. As an artist, This is what the general public usually sees. They're getting used to, they're accustomed to looking at a picture and describing, oh, it's a landscape with a little house in the background and it's mostly blue. The form, for the artist, this is the most significant part. This is 80% of everything we do, because we have to figure out how we, in subtle ways, in all the possibilities of the making and our choices and the process and our decision, we can make you see that in a particular way. We're hoping that we will give you an opening into an insight you might not have had. We have to do it that way. Viewers generally just see this without beginning to recognize how important this is. So if you take an art class, you're going to spend 80% of your time doing this. If you're a visual artist, you're always going to, especially if it's an abstract work, and it's not something you recognize and can call by a name, you're going to go, oh, what the heck, what subject is that? And then, of course, concept is usually what we start with. What is it in the first place that has really inspired us? In directing your abstract so that you have touched on all three of these in whichever order you choose and however you find them blending into each other, you will make sure that you have touched on the essentials that the readers will be looking for in your proposal. And I can talk on this for a whole hour, but we're going to keep going here. And the other way that we talk about it a lot with our students in the art department and particularly in the BFA, this is what we use for our critique process. Meaning, when you look at a work of our art, how can you begin to unpackage it? Think of it as a suitcase and you're pulling things out till you've got the full array of things spread around you, and you can come to understand its meaning. Observation is the first thing. Pull in as many clues as you can. Figure out how those clues are organized. Analyze them so it begins to coalesce as a single full picture of what it might be. Interpretation is the fun part, because that's where we get to put our sense of what it could be. And don't feel that your interpretation ever has to be what the artist says. And then finally, most important, at this point, sometimes it's not even necessary to do it. If you can get a good interpretation out of it, don't feel you have to rate its merit, because sometimes there isn't enough information there. But evaluation is, what merit does this work have? Does it help me see the world in a different way? Does it bring another voice to the conversation? How does it expand on how we think about things? Does it advocate for something? Does it provoke me in a way that helps me move forward or even backward? All those things are the merit. Evaluation is not whether you like it or not, but the value that it has for our communities and our societies. Art is really a way of mirroring back to us who we are. And something that does that well, in my estimation, has quite a bit of merit. Now, if you want to construct your abstract or your artist statement using this form, it's not a bad idea to start here and work backwards. Here's my goal, here's what I hope to do. When people see the work, this might be what they're thinking about. Here's how I'm going to bring the pieces together, and these are all the different parts that I'm going to work on so that this happens. So think about, if you use this process, consider working backwards. We could get the samples up here only because they're so large, but in each of the packets I've included 3 different ones. So you should take a look at them to see how concise and well written they are, and consider how close to either one of these methods each one holds, because you can then use those. If it sounds good to you, use it as your sample on how to construct yours. Some closing thoughts. First and foremost, there are more opportunities out there than you realized in this day and age, especially with the integration of disciplines and topics. people are really excited for all sorts of things, and especially in service learning as well. So don't be quick to close the door, you know, really persevere. If there's one thing artists have to learn, it's that. We have to be incredibly perseverant. Your application, you can talk about your work as exploring and experimenting with. Those are terms that are very familiar in science, and they are the same ones that we use in the arts. We're really exploring. We're experimenting with, we're questioning, all those same kind of terms, so that you can use those. And those really are the way we get at our solutions. It's just our solutions tend to be much more open-ended as we start. Any projects that you can do involving collaboration and partnerships are really highly encouraged and sought after, and sometimes those are the first ones to be supported financially, so don't forget that's an extra little plus, and it's a really kind of fun way to do it. Art, because it's a mirror, most often not brings one discipline, but many. It could be psychology, it could be economics, it could be politics, it could be, you name it, it's there with art. So that really gives you a leg up because of the breadth of what your proposal would have in it. And then finally, keep in mind that projects that empower the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged, are really the domain of the artist. These are kinds of, this is what we want to shed light on with in our work. And what I did put up there, and I was thinking about on my way over, is the fact that humor is really the domain of the artist as well. So don't necessarily get all bent out of shape if you're feeling pretty lighthearted or ironic about the piece. We don't have to be serious in our work at all necessarily. There is that whole facet of our life that brings beauty, entertainment, and enjoyment that will happen if you head through humor toward those points. Here are just a couple resources you might be interested in taking a look at. Writing for Artists, the Office for the Undergraduate Research, and I'm sure any of your advisors, the scholarship page, what am I forgetting that's probably pretty common? Oh, the writing resource, I think, the writing lab. Make sure you take your proposals to them once, twice, or even more. And then finally, thanks for thinking about this. These are really interesting pursuits and endeavors. And just because it's art, we should not think that it is not equally as necessary and important in the global kind of conversation. Yeah, it really happens a lot. And the final thing, and even though it isn't on here, I know I was pretty quick about both the methodologies and the process, but in your handout, I have a page and a half that steps you through it. Sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. So keep that in mind and keep it handy as you begin to write, because it can work as an outline for you of constructing your work. Do we have time for questions? Yeah, we got a little time. Any questions on it at all?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So as you're going through this presentation, the thought came to me as to how to incorporate maybe some sort of
samples.
Yeah, well, yes, just one, samples, but two, my idea was something like a coordinated care and how you can facilitate that into a hospital or something like that, as opposed to the general way how they have how they offer care at hospitals.
How you could make it a more rewarding kind of care, is that what you're thinking about?
Right, not only for the patient, but also for the hospital itself. So would I be speaking with hospital administrators and that like to sort of obtain data?
Here would be a case where I think it would be so exciting to put together a collaborative kind of combination, and I probably work with somebody in sociology. I would definitely work with somebody in the arts, and then, yeah, somebody in the administration, and talk about how can we make this much more of a quality experience, because we know people feel a whole lot better when it is that. So yeah, all those kinds of things are multidisciplinary, and those are the kinds of things that people are really excited to get involved with. So it's just a matter of finding the right personnel that can bring a couple of those important aspects of it to the table.
I was wondering if you could touch on your comment about the sample piece, because is it common within your discipline when writing for grant funding to include samples of previous work?
It is. It's very common because it's what gives us credibility in our field. So you might show samples of work you've done previously or exhibits you've had previously, writing, videos if you're in dance, music, movement, any of those kinds of things, because it sort of is your CV in a visual kind of way. And it's like, oh, these people are doing it already. We're not worried about handing out some funds to them. This isn't going to necessarily be a first time. They're very capable of it. So yes, definitely consider including samples in whatever form is best suited to your proposal.
When doing research, is it more common to start your own project and like do your own paintings, or is it more common to take the works of more famous artists or things like that and then interpret their work?
No, usually it's very much comes out of our own work, and in fact, we don't start with the painting. We start with our ideas, our sketchbooks, all those kinds of things that we've been compiling. I call it our bank accounts. We got all this stuff come together, and when you get enough of it together, you begin to see some of the bigger overarching themes that exist, and it turns into what we refer to as a body of work. And then it's just picking out particulars that are interest or might be very timely for that community, that culture, the era in which we live. For instance, right now, you know everything that's going on in the art world connected to technology. Because, you know, you guys do it in your sleep. I came to it the hard way. But there's so many really interesting things because it is what's happening in society. It is our culture, and art needs to reflect back to us where we're at. It's sort of the way that a culture can really get a sense of who we are, what we need, what's going well, what's not maybe going so well. So it usually is very much a specific interest and drive that oftentimes you need a few more items from your own personal arsenal that you've been saving up to give you a clear idea of what it is, in a way to state it in a single statement. For instance, when I did my grad work, I did a series of work. I studied memory, which now has led me to perception, which is now I'm talking about behavioral economics in my work very specifically. So if I started talking about what, you know, my content is, somebody would either put me in the business school or maybe in the social school, and yet I actually work in the art department. So we come from this very interesting kind of diverse place. That's what the beauty and the fun of our work is. You can bring so many things. You don't have to be specific. We can be broad. On the other hand, for you, for any individual, you have to trust yourself. You can believe in yourself and really go for that thing you're interested in. Seeing the forest for the trees, for me, is still the hardest problem, and I like to make the work, step back from it, look at it, and decide what it's really about. But this is why you have friends, you have advisors, you have teachers. You know, you write a lot, you free write, you maybe write that single statement of what you want your work, what you think your work is about a dozen or 2 dozen times before it, in your own mind, even starts to feel like, oh, there's a little clarity here with it. All right, thanks very much.
A lot of what I'm going to probably talk about will echo a lot of what she said as well. So I hope you don't mind my approach. I just got done with an 1.5-hour PowerPoint lecture, and I thought any more PowerPoint, my eyes might explode in my head. So I'd rather just kind of have it be more like a conversation and open it up for questions if they come up while we're going, or at least at the end. But this idea of developing a research question, I don't know if there's a single subject in research that may be more important than a research question. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But before I do that, I want to compliment you guys for even being here. You're showing some sort of interest in research. If you look at the way the economy has caused this flood of people back to education, what it's doing, it's good, and an educated society is much more productive, but it's making the value of advanced degrees a little bit more important, where more people are getting associate's and bachelor's degrees. So if you have an interest in graduate school, which many students do now, even more so than 10 or 15 years ago, getting into graduate school is kind of one of those obstacles that's in your future. And I can tell you that getting into graduate school, one of your tickets in is going to be some sort of research experience. So being here, saying, hey, I'm a little bit interested in research, I think puts you ahead of the game. So anyway, as you look at your research question, what it's going to do for you is it's going to help you get funding, it's going to help you get approval through the Institutional Review Board, and really it's going to guide your entire study. So for me, developing a solid research question and knowing what it is that you want to look at comes before anything else. Just to give you some personal experiences. So I've been on the IRB committee for our college for a number of years, and I'll tell you, we don't get many proposals where we immediately go to work saying, what is it that they're trying to show, or what question are they trying to answer, and how are they doing it? That's our first question, because our responsibility on this Institutional Review Board is to make sure that we're protecting human subjects. And so, you know, for an example, so let's say that you wanted to look at jogging, and your question was, does jogging increase anxiety? Okay, that's a fair question, maybe a little bit broad, and we'll talk about that in a second. But then if your proposal comes in and you want to take 1,000 8-year-olds, make them jog for 4 hours, and then see if they feel more anxious afterwards, you might answer the question, and I could probably tell you right now, they're going to feel a little bit more anxious after jogging for 4 hours. But the problem is you're not really answering your question well with your methods. We have an ethical problem with your methods. We start to see some problems because your research question doesn't fit real well with what you're doing. And so you'll see that that happens over and over again. In the grant process, so as you're trying to get funding for your research, this happens time and time again. And I can tell you from being on that committee, probably the single largest holdup that we have with projects is that we don't understand the research question. And I can't tell you how many times we've sat around those tables and the committee said, I just don't understand what they're trying to do. Or I don't understand what the research question is. I can't figure out from reading this thing 2 or 3 times, what is it that the student actually wants to show with their project. And so I see some of you take notes, which is awesome. Write this down. There should be no question about your question. And in fact, when I taught the research class in MLS for about 8 years, we started just in the last few years to say, start your grant with your question. The purpose of my research is to answer the question, and there it is. Because as you do that, and this reviewer is looking at it, they don't have the chance to say, well, I don't really know what he wanted to do. You know, it's right there for them to see right off the bat. Now your methods and other things are going to come into play, and they're definitely a factor, but you got to make sure that that research question is super clear. Because if it's not, you're going to leave a team of reviewers, whether it's for Institutional Review Board or grant committees, you're going to leave them guessing at what it is that you're trying to do. And that's a bad case if these people have their hands in the pot of money to give to you. And I'll tell you, if they can't find that question real soon or real quick through your proposal, the rest of it's not going to matter that much. I don't care much about your budget if they have no idea what it is that you're trying to do. So the question is, how do you find an appropriate research question? And I don't want to go through hours that we could spend on the scientific method where you make some observations and you ask a question and you develop a hypothesis and you design an experiment to answer your hypothesis. But the process is important when you're thinking about how do I go about generating what it is that I want to study. And so I hope I'm not hurting feelings, but the observations that you might make in the general world as you walk from class to class or as you're sitting at home, that's probably not a great source for a research question. Let me give you an example, and I call this kind of a doorknob approach, and I hope I don't offend anyone by referring to them as doorknobs, but sometimes we get these doorknob questions like, hey, people use the doorknob to open the door. And and their hands are probably dirty, so there's got to be stuff growing on that doorknob. So I'm going to swab the doorknob and find out what's growing. It's not bad from a scientific method standpoint, but it's probably been done for a 6th grade science fair. So when I get college level doorknob suggestion like that, I try to get the students to look a little bit deeper. Okay? It's not a bad thought process to go through, but if it's just something general like that, it's probably been tackled before. Now, if you want to answer why men are different than women, it's been approached for like thousands of years, and unless you've got something really novel and really unique, you're not going to be able to tackle that question. I don't want to hurt feelings. You're probably not going to cure cancer as an undergraduate. It's just not going to happen. Now, there might be a tiny little piece of the process that you don't fully understand and that you're starting to think, hey, I've heard about this in some classes. I've had professors talk to me about it. I've read some papers about it. This just seems like a question that no one's answered yet. And that's a great way to start investigating a potential idea. And so I have, for your notes, the best sources to go to for the beginning of your research question. And there are 3 P's: papers, practice, and professors. So let's say that your passion, and I'm going to just steal your idea, tell me your name.
Raymond.
Raymond. So Raymond, you're talking about hospitals and care and people getting better. So let's say that that's Raymond's desire. That's what he wants to study. A great place to start looking for some potential avenues for exploration is in published papers about patient care and patient well-being. As you start reading through subjects, you'll find real quick what you're interested in and what you're not. If it's a paper that's killing you to read and you hate it, then don't explore that as part of your research, because you'll hate your own research by the time you're done. But as you're reading and these things are interesting to you, what's going to happen, either from your own curiosity or even at the very bottom of that paper, they're going to have some suggestions for future research. Or some, hey, this was a pretty good study, but this was lacking, or this is missing, or we don't really understand this yet, or it would be important for a future researcher to look at this, that, or the other. Or as you're reading it, you might be saying, yeah, but what about this? Or yeah, but what about that? So looking at other research is a great way to get an idea for your own. And I'll tell you when I was an undergraduate student and as I was trying to develop my own research question, I kind of felt like I was cheating. Like, well, they've already done the research. I don't want to go to that study and then just pull from it. That's how research works. That's how it flows. It's iterative. It goes from one step to the next to the next. And so that process of finding a research question embedded in somebody else's research is a great place to start. The other nice thing about that is you've got to be doing literature searching anyway. So now you just read 5 articles, you've got a question, and 5 articles that are going to support your work. Practice, so if you get into a clinical field or if you have the chance to get out into the field and do research, as you're doing that or as you're having those experiences, questions are going to come up. I had a group of students a number of years ago that said, one of them was working in a hospital in the lab. She said, you know, it doesn't seem like we have a real clear policy on how we do our chemical testing for urinalysis. Sometimes it seems like we have to centrifuge the sample, and sometimes we don't centrifuge it. Kind of seems like there might be a difference. Perfect. It's a great project. They said, as a research question, does centrifuging a urine sample cause any sort of change in the chemical reactions? It's easy. You know, you can understand the question. The methods follow very closely to that. Hey, we'll get a whole bunch of different samples. We'll test them. We'll centrifuge them. We'll test them again and see if there's a difference. It led to simple methods. It led to a really clear write-up. And last I heard from these students, they were still thinking about publishing it. And I think they probably could in a clinical laboratory science journal. So sometimes just observing something that seems a little bit off and no one's really answered that question is a good place to go. You know, I think about, and I don't know, Dr. Cabot can correct this if I'm wrong, but we had a study not too long ago where someone wanted to look at bee populations. Because out in the field doing some field work, they had noticed that there was a decrease in a certain flower, and they knew that a particular bee species pollinated that flower. So just observing, hey, I don't have as many flowers in this area as we do in other areas of Utah. Well, could it be that it's the bee population that's suffering? You know, not so much a chemical in the soil that's causing the flowers to die or something like that. So in making these observations, these questions come up, and if that question hasn't been explored, now you've got a really nice project that can build off of similar projects. And then finally, your professors. So the chances are pretty good that if you're doing an undergraduate research project, you're going to be doing it under the mentorship of a professor. And so to approach that professor to see if they have some sort of interest in what your interest is a great way to start. And it's always kind of awkward, and I hope I don't disrespect, but it kind of seems like asking somebody out on a date, like a dance, where you kind of open the door and you kind of come in and you're timid and like, hey, Dr. Cabot, how are you? You know, I was kind of hoping to do some research. I'm really interested in birds and migration and nesting habits, and I know that that's kind of your interest too. I was wondering if there's any way that we might be able to work together on a project. You know, if you came to me and asked me about that, and I know nothing about birds and nesting or anything like that, it's going to be a mismatch. And I'm going to be like, I'm not the right guy. So you're kind of trying to sell yourself as a researcher. And I'll tell you a couple of things that are going to help. First of all, knowing the subject and what you're approaching, but also dangling a carrot for the professor. So if you add in there, and I'm really interested in publishing my research when it's all done, so we could be co-authors on this thing. Every professor wants to get some publications out there, so if they know you're interested in publishing, and they know that they can help you get to that point, because that's our purpose, but they can also get their name on the paper, then you're starting to develop a little bit of interest in that professor, or that professor's going to have an interest in what you're doing. Also, if you approach a professor, a lot of times they're just going to have ideas that they're already working on. So it's not uncommon to find that professors have a few things in the works, or I'd really like to look at this, but I just haven't had time yet, or I just finished a study and it brought up 3 more different questions that we'd like to look at. Those are awesome opportunities to jump in there with a faculty member and say, let me tackle that question, I'd love to do that. And so they're a great source for ideas for research as well. So, once you're to that point and you kind of have an idea, you need to develop the question. And the process of developing the question can take some time. Some of the things to ask yourself as you're trying to make your question work. Number one, and I know this seems kind of childish, but is it answerable? Can you actually come up with an answer? Can you create a study that's going to answer the question? So going back to my dorky, why are men different than women? I don't know that you're going to be able to answer that in a semester-long project. Or even if you spend a year or 10 years, you're probably not going to have one single answer that's going to explain why we're different. Now, if you want to look at how do men at Weber State University perceive the testing center compared to women and how they perceive the testing center? Do they like it or not? What are the differences between men and women? Okay, now you've narrowed it down, and I really like Dr. Stevenson's graphic where she showed it narrowing in the sciences. Once you've narrowed it down to something specific enough, could I answer the question, are there differences in the perceptions about the testing centers at Weber State between men and women? That seems answerable. I could do that. Are men and women different at Weber? Yes, but how am I going to prove that? How am I going to show that? And so making sure that your question is something you can actually answer is a pretty important step. Another question, do meteorites flying through space change the amount of time it's going to take me to cook my Pop-Tart? It's a cool question, right? I'd love to know, but are you really going to be able to answer that? Are you going to be able to measure meteorite movement in space and have people cooking Pop-Tarts at the same time? And it's a decent question. It's not something that's probably going to be answerable. So you want to make sure that you're keeping your ideas realistic and also keeping your scope narrow enough that you're not trying to solve mankind's mysteries as an undergraduate research project. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Is there some factual support for what you're looking at? And I had a group of students 2 years ago, they approached me and they said, we want to look at the positive effects of tanning. And originally I was like, oh, because what we hear about a lot in science is the negative effects of tanning. And so I said, I don't know. And they said, no, wait, let us give you some reasons behind this or why we think that we could do this. And they started talking about UV light exposure and how it's beneficial to vitamin K development and it's beneficial to stress in some cases. And as they started to develop this, they said, look, we could look at cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, and see if exposure to UV light changes those cortisol levels. So now it went from, hey, is tanning okay, to can we see a noticeable change in the stress hormone cortisol based on UV light exposure? So they took an idea that was kind of more of an idea and they narrowed it down into something that was really answerable. It made sense. They had some support for positive effects of UV light exposure and then could then piggyback off of that into their project. And so my initial reaction, like, oh crap, don't try to tackle that, ended up working out because they were able to provide some support why their question made sense, why it was logical, why it needed to be answered. And that's one of the things I always say, your question should be something that makes people, when you tell them your question, go, yeah, why haven't we looked into that? Or why haven't we answered that? Or why has science not approached that question? You know, if there are some positive effects to tanning, why hasn't anybody looked at that more closely? So it needs to be something that kind of stimulates someone to think, yeah, that's a logical question. If someone's like, that doesn't make any sense, why would we care? Then it's a little bit harder to get that question into a research study. Now I need to probably put an asterisk on that. There's a lot of different things out there that are researchable, and some of them aren't going to matter to some people and will matter to others, and isolating some minor protein and some cell membrane from some weird species of bug in some jungle, it may not matter to me, but it could still very well be a relevant, important, logical, good question. So make sure that you're not saying, oh, the average person's not going to care about this, so I need to throw it out as a question. That doesn't necessarily apply, but it does need to be something that's answerable, and that someone in that field would say, yeah, that's something we should probably look at. Okay. Next, I'm going to skip that. Does your question lead to sound research methods? So as you're putting together your question, does the idea of how you're going to answer that question make sense? And that's sometimes a disconnect that we see in grant proposals, is that they have a decent question, but then it doesn't seem like their methods serve to answer that question. So make sure that as you're going through the question process, you say, okay, here's my question. Now, how is my study going to answer that question? And as you're developing your methods and you're developing what you want to do, that should always be your question that you ask yourself. Is this study or experiment or what I'm doing answering the question that I'm proposing? And if there's a disconnect there, then it's probably not going to work. I don't want to pick on a student, but I had a student approach me some time ago who he had been to Africa and he had seen the African women and men carrying things on their head and saying, hey, I know what that does to posture. I know the pressure that that puts on the muscles. It seems like it could cause a lot of back and neck problems. Well, his approach was to see if massage therapy would alleviate some of that pain. And so a very good research question would be, do massage therapy techniques help to alleviate pain in head carriers in Ghana during a 2-month period of time where we introduce it and we have them practice it or whatever? But because there was a disconnect there, we read the proposal many times and couldn't figure out where he went from his research question to what he was actually trying to show or prove. And it was sad because we didn't end up funding the project. Now he may resubmit, but the whole reason we didn't fund the project, not because there wasn't some merit to it, not because it wasn't a good question, but because we couldn't make the connection between a question and the methods. So make sure you're keeping track of that when you're creating your study. So let me just give you a couple of examples and then we'll open it up to questions. So we had a few students a number of years ago that wanted to see if tourniquets that phlebotomists were using could actually spread disease. So their question started out being, do dirty tourniquets lead to increased transmission of disease in the hospital? Not a bad question, but if you start to think about how you would do that, okay, I got to monitor how many tourniquets are dirty, what's the prevalence of dirty tourniquets, how are they spreading infection, I've got to limit all other sources of infection spread in a hospital. And as they started to compound the idea, it got really ugly. And it wasn't something that they were very easy, or that they couldn't answer very easily. They went forward with it, they sent out a survey, they asked phlebotomists, hey, do you use a brand new tourniquet every time, or using the same ones? They got poor responses back from their survey, and their survey didn't really serve to answer the question. And I'll tell you, and I know these students, and that's why I'm picking on them, when they got up to present their research at the annual symposium, like Dr. Stevenson was talking about disseminating the information, you could tell they were embarrassed. Because they were trying to answer a question with methods that didn't answer the question. And so as they stood up there and they said, of our 16 responses, 4 of them meant it just didn't fit, it didn't flow. And so keep an eye on that you need to be able to answer the question. And if you can't, then your methods are off, or you may need to rework the question or start with a new one. Let me give you an example. This is actually, I pulled this from a grant application. And I want to use this as an example because I think it speaks to a certain type of project we get a lot of. So the student wrote, the goal of for this project is to successfully implement an autopilot system for the use with an unmanned aerial system in order to perform data analysis using a geographic information system. I will program an autopilot system that will communicate with the camera system in order to provide a smooth transition between data and the GIS. And then they went on to talk about more of this project. Well, we read this and I remember thinking, this is interesting, this is cool, this will be a great learning experience for the student, but what is it that you're trying to answer? And I think if they had simply worded it like, could we develop this system that will help integrate between the camera and a control station on the ground, or is it possible to implement or to make this system and have it do whatever it was intended to do? If they had kind of just rephrased it in the form of a question, it would have been easier for us as a committee to go through and say, oh, okay, that's a question that we could answer by letting a student or funding a student to do that, to perform that project, to build that system and to see if it works. You know, so it just wasn't set up as a research question and it left us wondering, okay, what is it that you're trying to do besides build this thing? And so these types of projects where they're very application-based are great. We would never discourage that. So the College of Applied Science and Technology, great projects, but when you're applying for research funds, to see a research question is very, very helpful. So I'll cut my example short because I know we're almost out of time. Any questions?
Is there like an aha moment, like, yes, this is the question, so like when do you know, like, yes, this is the question, or do you sometimes change the question as you're doing, you know, further analyses of developing your methods and other things, I guess?
That's a very good question. I don't know if there's ever really an aha moment. Now, sometimes there's a question that you just are dying to answer. In fact, I had one student one time who said, you know, I'm really curious to know if you're in a car and there's a hummingbird in the car, and the hummingbird is just kind of hovering in the car, and you turn really fast, is the hummingbird going to go with the car, or is it going to smack against the window? And I sat there for a minute, and I was like, A, I have no idea. B, where did that come from? But see, I could tell that the student really cared. They really wanted to know. You could probably do an experiment and answer that question. My best response to that would be probably in discussing your question with others in your field, and specifically a faculty mentor, is where you're really going to understand, hey, is this answerable? Is it logical? Is it within the scope of an undergraduate project? Is it something that's doable? But also going to the literature to see what other people have looked at on that same subject. You may find someone's already answered the question, or you may find that someone's tried to and it's fraught with, you know, problems and things. So really working through the process, talking to faculty mentors, going through the literature. You don't necessarily rework the question as you're gathering findings, because at that point, if you change your initial question, it's a little bit, I don't want to say unethical, but we usually want to start with a solid question and try to answer that question. That's not to say that other questions aren't going to come up as you go through the process. But to start with a good, solid question that you can answer is probably the best approach, instead of changing it as you go. A little tweak here or there, probably not a big deal, but changing the whole thing halfway through the game is not such a great idea.
An approach that has worked for me, and I'm actually a PhD student, working in the education phase, is don't start with a question, create a problem statement, and then develop the question out of that statement. So recently I was working on a case study of domestic violence in Afghanistan. So the problem statement was domestic violence is a significant cultural issue in Afghanistan. So what would my question be from that? Well, we went through several different questions that we decided to look at. Okay, so domestic violence is a cultural issue in Afghanistan. why is domestic violence such a big issue in Afghanistan? Is it culturally learned? You know, how is it passed down? Stuff like that. So sometimes it's a lot easier to start with a statement
Sure.
and then develop your question out of that.
Sure. And that's going back to that logic, you know, is this problem logical, and are the solutions or the questions to be asked about the problem or the observation logical? Okay, well, once again, you guys, thanks for being here. I think it shows some forward thinking.